Now, someone in this classroom came to me and asked for guidance in using foul language because apparently I am a renowned expert at using foul language. So here we go. Number one, you've got to be comfortable using it. If you're not comfortable using it, it's not going to be authentic. It's like watching an actor try to smoke who's not an actual smoker. It's distracting. Don't do that. So don't use it if you're not comfortable. Number two, read the room. Know what you can get by with. Church? No. Mother-in-law's house? No. In 34 years of marriage, I have only said the F word in front of my mother-in-law one time because some heifer was trying to force us off the road. It was Arkansas. Classroom? Maybe. Shop floor? Probably. Oil rig? Oh, hell yeah. Okay, so read the room. Now, make sure though, now that you know what you can get by with, that you always do less than that. And here's why. If you overuse this sort of language, it loses its spiciness, right? And the reason we're going to be using it at all is the verbal equivalent of bold, underline, and italics. It's to snap people out of a stupor and get their attention, which I guarantee you, when I told you all the following your passions was horseshit, I got your attention, right? But if I say it too much, then it loses it. Any questions about that? Okay, let's get back to work. We are in chapter 7, and oh, come on, wake up. The last time we were talking about the hockey stick problem. Do you guys remember the hockey stick diagram? Come on. There we go. Okay, so why do people do this hockey stick thing? Remember why people might throw out those kind of Yeah, so basically they're throwing out these big cash flows there far into the future to get the NPV above zero so their project will be accepted, by which time, and by the time we figure out that this is happening, they're gone, right? So if some of you will end up being commercial lenders, and when someone brings you a business plan and they've got a set of cash flows that looks like this, be very, very skeptical. Any questions? Okay. Now, let's talk about discounted payback. Remember, we said one of the problems with payback is that it doesn't account for the time value of money. So someone said, well, wait a minute. What if we just discount those future cash flows at a rate appropriate to the risk? Then that will take care of that. Now, it solves the time value of money problem. It does not solve the cash flows after payback problem. And it requires the same ingredients as NPV plus an arbitrary cutoff. Folks, this is a piece of junk. It's a piece of junk. If I've got the ingredients to make NPV, why wouldn't I do that? Remember, that's the gold standard. This thing reminds me of something my mom used to make. So I like crackers, and I like eggs, and I like ground beef, and I like ketchup. But my mother would mix all this stuff into something called meatloaf. Now there's always 2 or 3 freaks in a class that really like meatloaf. I'm sorry, 2 or 3 people in a class that really like meatloaf. But that is some nasty stuff. I'm like, Mom, why would you take such beautiful ingredients and make something so detestable? She never did have a good answer. Okay, except for the fact that she liked meatloaf. Now, this thing is meatloaf because you're taking beautiful ingredients and you're turning them into crap. So don't do that. I'm not going to ask you to be able to calculate these or use these as long as you can make the meatloaf speech to your boss when the time comes to let them know that this is a dog with fleas. Questions? Okay. Now let's move on to the average accounting return. The average accounting return, or AAR, is, got to take a deep breath here, the average project earnings after taxes and depreciation divided by the average book value of the investment over the life of the investment. It turns out there's only one thing that accountants like more than numbers, and that is words. Oh my goodness, that is a lot of words. Let me finance boil that down for you. That's actually just average net income over average book value. Average net income over average book value. So what do we need in order to use this thing? We need projected accounting earnings. From the income statement, what are accounting earnings? Which one would we be looking for? Net income, who said that? Oh man, would you pass this up to Mr. Sabev? No pocketing that coin, Mr. Gonzalez. Okay. Projected, so we're looking for net income. And so we also need the investment amount and a depreciation schedule. Why do we need a depreciation schedule? Because first of all, we're going to need depreciation to figure out net income. Secondly, we're also going to need the depreciation schedule to figure out the book value of the assets. And remember, the bottom part of that AAR is the average book value. And then finally, we need a minimum acceptable AAR, which is another one of these arbitrary cutoffs. Only this time, instead of having someone in your unit that comes up with this arbitrary cutoff, it's most likely going to be the controller of the firm. Remember, the controller is the top accountant of the firm. And so what is the rule? The rule is to accept all projects with AAR greater than or equal to the minimum AAR. So it's a greater than or equal to. So here is our example. We have a 5-year project here, and we have an income statement for each of those 5 years. And at the bottom of each of those income statements, we have the net income. So that's our measurement of forecasted accounting earnings. And we can kind of figure out from looking at this how much the initial investment is. The depreciation, by the way, we always depreciate straight line to 0 unless we are told otherwise. How much depreciation is there in those 5 years of income statements? 500,000. So 500,000 is our initial investment. Now, would I make you guess that on an exam? Absolutely not. Okay, so now we've got the average net income. It's easy enough. You just add those net income numbers together, divide by 5. Why 5? Guys, we got 5 years with the net income there, right? Now, the average investment. At time 0, I'm going to invest $500,000 here. And the way depreciation works is that every year when I charge that depreciation off, the book value of the asset drops by the same amount. So at time 0, I've got $500,000. I depreciate it by $100,000 at time 1. What is the new book value? $400,000. And then at year 2, I depreciated another $100,000, and what's the new book value? $300,000. And I keep doing this until I get down to a book value of 0 in the last year. And that makes perfect sense because we're straight line depreciating to 0. Then we add all that up and we divide by 6. Why 6 and not 5?
That's what page 0. That's the end of your 5.
Yeah, so we've got time 0 plus we've got years 1 through 5. So we've actually got 6 different values there. That's why we're dividing by 6. Okay, now when I do that, something interesting happens. The average investment is exactly 1/2 the initial investment. If you are straight line depreciating to 0, then the average book value is always 1/2 the initial investment. Let me say that again. If you are straight line depreciating to 0, the average book value is always 1/2 the initial investment. So in some solutions, if you're playing around with stuff from Connect, you'll see that on the bottom, instead of figuring out this average investment, they just take the initial investment divided by 2. That's the reason, because you're straight line depreciating to 0, you take 1/2 of the initial investment. Okay, so that gives us an average net income of $50,000 divided by our average book value of $250,000. If I do the math out, that gives me 20%. If my arbitrary cutoff is 15%, do I accept or reject the project? If it's the arbitrary cutoff is 15%, do I accept or reject the project? Yeah, we accept it, right? Because we're over and above that minimum. What if it's the arbitrary cutoff is 25%? What do I do? Reject it. What if the arbitrary cutoff is 20%? I accept it because the rule is accept all projects with AAR greater than or equal to the arbitrary cutoff. Okay, now one thing I want to point out here. The taxes up here show as negative. In the real world, if you lose money, does the government send you a check? No. There are some things called tax loss carry forwards and things like that. But for capital budgeting projects, we always assume that the project is on top of an otherwise profitable firm, and that any negative taxes from the project will simply be used to reduce the overall taxes of the organization. They were going to owe $100,000. Now they only owe $83,333 because of this negative taxes from this project. So let me say that one more time. In capital budgeting, it's okay to have negative taxes because we assume that the project is on top of an otherwise profitable company, and therefore that this negative taxes will just be used to offset the positive taxes from other parts of the company. Questions? Okay. Now let's ask these questions. Does AAR account for the time value of money? No, man, we stuck those net incomes, we all stuck them in there, and we treated them all as being equally valid and equally important, and we just averaged them. So no, it doesn't account for the time value of money. Does it account for the riskiness of the cash flows? No, you may have accountants occasionally say, well, you know, for a riskier project, we would require a higher AAR. And I would say, that's great. Tell me how you scientifically determined that arbitrary cutoff for this increased level of risk. And the answer that you'll get will be, because there is no scientific background to what this arbitrary cutoff, like there is to our required rate of return that we have in finance. Remember, Chapter 12 is all about scientifically determining that required rate of return. And finally, does it provide any information regarding the wealth created by the project? Not one bit. Not one bit. Okay, so you say, wait a minute, AAR then must be a dog with fleas? People certainly don't use it. The answer is yes, they do. And the first reason is not a good reason to use this, and that is that the numbers are readily available and people are lazy. Give me an example. When I was at Halliburton, I had this accountant, his name was Jack. Jack was the only person in the business unit to be in an office by himself with no windows. It was like a cave with just the fluorescent lighting. And the way you could make Jack's day was go by and say, hey Jack, I need some numbers. And Jack would, he was very happy to see me, right? Because I'm asking for numbers. Now, Jack would, he loved spreadsheets, right? He would come up with this stuff all day long. It doesn't take me one bit of effort. So it was real easy for me to get these kind of numbers from Jack. Number two, it's easy to calculate. Did we have to use the TIBA2 plus? No, not at all. That's also not necessarily a good reason to use it. Now, here's one that finally might make sense, and that is that stockholders and media pay attention to accounting returns ROE and ROA. And in fact, AAR looks a whole lot like ROA, which is net income over total assets. Well, hey, we're just looking at average net income over the average total assets of the project. So you might make an argument there that as long as we accept projects with an ROA greater than or with an AAR greater than the firm's ROA, that we'll be doing ourselves a favor, except for one thing. It doesn't account for the risks of the project. Just because something has a higher ROA doesn't mean that it's creating wealth. It could be something extraordinarily risky, and of course it would need a higher ROA. And so you might be taking on higher ROA projects and raising the ROA of the firm overall, but the risk might be increasing out of proportion to that. So, still not buying this as a good measure. The final reason is sometimes your boss is an accountant. I don't remember hearing anything about this at Halliburton until we got a new CEO who had grown up in the world as an accountant. And suddenly, in addition to the real stuff, we had to calculate AAR. Now let's talk about the difference between being right and being employed. Let's assume that your boss invites you in to talk about a project. Says we need a new milling machine, and I want you to go out and do an average accounting return on it. And if the average accounting return is 20% or greater, we will accept the project. And you say, yes, sir. And then you go out, and not only do you do the AAR, you also do NPV. Now, if AAR and NPV provide the same answer, for instance, to accept the project, you go to the boss and you say, average accounting return 23%. Boss, you're a genius. We should accept the project. And you don't even mention the NPV. Now, same thing is true if they both recommend to reject. But what if AAR says to accept and NPV says to reject? You go to your boss and you say, boss, the AAR was 23%, but just to be sure, I also ran NPV. And it turns out that this project has a negative NPV and therefore will destroy shareholder value. NPV says not to accept this project. At which point, your boss says, AAR 23%, we accept. What do you do? Yeah, you salute, you say yes sir, you go back to your office and you get out your logbook. Have I talked about the logbook in here before? You get out, so back in my day the logbook was an actual book. It was this hardbound book I had in my lower right hand drawer, and I would pull it out and I would write down today's date. And I would say, Bob asked me to do a review for the new milling machine, and then I would write down the details. I told Bob it was a shareholder wealth destroying project. Bob told me to proceed anyway. I stick the book in my drawer, I shut the drawer, and I wait. What am I waiting for? Yeah, the investigation! When someone figures out that this thing is a dog with fleas and they show up at my office and they're like, Haggard, your name is all over this project. What's up with that? Are you stupid? And I say, whoop, wait. And I pull out my logbook and I open it up and I say, October 21st, Bob asked me to do this review. I told him it was a bad idea. He said we do it anyway. And then I say, would you like a photocopy of that? Now, how does this story end? Yeah, so Bob may get fired, right? And what does that make? What does that create for me? Opportunity, right? Opportunity. Okay, now I'm not telling you guys that you should have a hardbound book. You know, an electronic would probably be okay. But I can tell you this: when they say, "Wait a minute, I'll bet Haggard just figured that out and wrote that note today." Well, when I've got this hardbound book and I can open it up, and right after that it says Ramon was late again today and he blamed it on his kids. You know, it kind of, and these are all in different ink colors because I've used different pens over time. It kind of gives a proof that I actually wrote that at the time that I did. So that's the one benefit of paper over electronic. Questions?
How many issues did you have before you realized that you needed to log everything?
Well, this is a good question. The first day on the job, another supervisor told me that this was the way to go about it. And he was using it primarily for personnel discipline issues. Today, Frank came to work again with no pants, right? And you got to document these things. By the way, that also, you'd need to write Frank up because it's not acceptable. Anyway, but yeah, you got to write these stuff up. But he says, and sometimes, our manager will ask us to do stupid stuff too. He says, always write that down. Oh, yeah. Of course, I also came out of nuclear power where we wrote everything down with military time, right? So there's always documentation. Other questions? Okay. So that's the end of the average accounting return. Will I have you work problems on that? Yes. Do I expect you to go out and recommend others to use it? No. Now we're on to the internal rate of return. Now, here is a definition that you actually need to have written on your formula sheet. Here is a definition you actually need to have on your formula sheet. And that is that the internal rate of return is the discount rate that makes the net present value of a project zero. It's just the discount rate that makes the net present value of a project zero. And our rule is, with a few exceptions, our rule is accept all projects with IRR greater than the appropriate discount rate. That appropriate discount rate is precisely the same one that we use for calculating NPV. That discount rate is exactly the same one that we will use for calculating NPV. And so it turns out if, for most cases, and I have to keep saying that because I'm going to show you some weirdness. For most cases, if the IRR is greater than the discount rate, that means that the project has a positive NPV. If the IRR is less than the discount rate, then the project has a negative NPV. So what do you need to do IRR? Well, we need the initial investment amount. We need the future cash flows and their timing, and we need a discount rate appropriate to the risk of the future cash flows. Those are exactly the same things that we need for NPV. So you might think that I'm going to make a meatloaf speech about IRR if it turns out not to be perfect, but you will find that there are uses for it. So here's a very simple example. You have a project that will pay $110 a year from today for an investment of $100 today. What is the IRR? And so we have our NPV is equal to minus 100 plus 110 divided by, what's the required return? We don't know, right? That's what we're trying to find. So this is going to be our IRR when NPV is equal to what? 0. So I'm going to set this whole thing equal to 0, and then I'm going to solve for R. And it's easy enough to figure out that R is 10%, 0.10 or 10%. Now you're saying, wow, this IRR is really easy. But here's the problem. What if we have a cash flow that's more than 1 year out into the future? If we have multiple cash flows. For instance, what if we have this cash flow happens 3 times? Anybody here solve for R? Mr. Sabab, I figured you have the best mathematical education of anyone in this room because he didn't go to American school. Can you solve for R? No. You really can't. And so what you end up doing is called repeated guessing or iteration. Iteration is repeated guessing. So what do? Well, I start off with a guess for R. And I plug that in. And if that guess is too small, the NPV that I calculate will be positive. And if my guess is too large, then this will be negative. And so I keep going back and forth until I find R. That's iteration. Now, your success or failure is often based on how good your first guess is. Does that sound terrible? Oh, yeah. So I actually had a class called Heat Transfer in Mechanical Engineering School, and we had to do this to solve for stuff. And the problem would either take you 2 minutes or 30 minutes, depending on how good your first guess was. Are you guys starting to dread the next exam? Don't fear, because your TI BA2 Plus is so much better at guessing than you will ever be. In fact, when you calculate an IRR with your TI BA2 Plus, you can eyeball that thing and watch, and it sits there and it twitches a bit before it spits the number out. As opposed to an NPV, which it calculates directly with the IRR, and then, whoo, right? So watch when you actually do it. Now, it's not going to be visible on the screen when I use the big calculator, because this computer is simply too powerful, but you'll see it on your calculator. Okay, sorry. Okay, so we're going to do an IRR example here. This is starting to get real. So we have an investment of $200 today, get you $100 per year for the next 3 years. What is the IRR? We're going to use the CF key. And we're going to say CF, second, clear work. 200 today is CF0. Enter, arrow down. What is C? Oh, by the way, does that first one need to be negative? Yeah. Boom. Enter. Arrow down. What's C0? 1. 100. Enter. Arrow down. What's F01? 3. Why? Yeah, it happens 3 times in a row, right? Okay, and there aren't any other cash flows, so now we're ready. If you had to guess what button we're going to hit to find IRR, what would you think it would be? IRR, very good. There's a button just for that. Now, you would think the calculator would be smart enough to go ahead and compute, because you obviously want IRR, but it's not. Look at that. There's a little compute up here at top. It's telling you what you need to do. So we're going to hit compute. And there we go. We've got 23.375%. Now let's run a little experiment here. We're going to say store 1. And we're going to go to NPV. And we're going to put this in as the discount rate. Recall 1. Enter. I'm going to arrow down and compute NPV. What should it be by the definition? 0. Should be 0. Boom. 1.28 times 10 to the negative 11th. For those of you who are unfamiliar with scientific notation, here's what that is. It's negative 0.00000000000128. And keeping in mind the 0.01 here would be 1 cent. Can we agree that this number is really 0? Yeah. It's just rounding error within the calculator. That's the only thing that's making this the way that it is. Okay. So now we know that that is the IRR. If your discount rate, your appropriate discount rate is 20%, would you accept or reject the project? You'd accept it, right? And what if your appropriate discount rate is 25%? You reject it. What if your appropriate discount rate is 23.375%? Reject. Because remember, what's the rule for accepting 0 NPV projects? We don't do that, right? And if a project has the same IRR as the same as its discount rate, by definition, it has 0 NPV, right? And so you basically have to have an IRR greater than the appropriate discount rate. Okay, now let's do our 3 questions. Does IRR account for the time value of money? Yeah, these are present values of future cash flows, right? That's what we were doing there. Number 2, does it address the riskiness of the cash flows? The Sego says yes. How? Because we're comparing against the discount rate, which was determined from the risk of the cash flows, right? And finally, does it provide information regarding the wealth created by the project? I'm going to go with, and I will accept both yes and no here. And here's why. Does it give us an exact number? No. Does it tell us whether wealth was created or destroyed? Yeah, it does. And so we're going to give it a half star for that one. So this is a 2.5 star measure. This is a 2.5 star measure. So you're already looking at this a little sideways. And then we say, well, wait a minute, there are a couple of problems with this thing that we need to talk about. And the first has to do with independent versus mutually exclusive projects. Independent projects, the acceptance of one has nothing to do with the acceptance or rejection of another. So, I'm deciding on buying a new robot lawnmower, and my wife might be thinking about taking up the piano, and we've got enough money to do both. They are not mutually exclusive. They are independent projects. But there are some projects that if you take one, then you can't do the other. For example, in this country, under our current laws, you can only be married to one person at a time, right? So marriage is a mutually exclusive kind of thing. You can't get two marriage proposals and accept them both. You have to choose between the two. Undoubtedly, many of you were accepted at Harvard into their MBA program and at MSU. You couldn't do both at the same time, but you made the right choice. You're here, right? Okay, so the problem that we see is when we have mutually exclusive projects, IRR can lead to bad decisions. IRR can lead to bad decisions. So let's take a look here. This is, you're going to build, you've got a corner street lot in Los Angeles. By the way, weather in Los Angeles, hot and dry year-round. And so it's really good to have a snow cone stand in Los Angeles. Do you guys know what snow cones are? Hawaiians will call them shave ice. It's basically just snow with sticky syrup all over it. People don't even refer to them as flavors. They're red and blue, right? They call them by colors. Okay. So, you could either do a snow cone stand or a nightclub, a swanky nightclub. You guys know what swanky means? What does swanky mean, Mr. Ellis?
It's kind of groovy, fun.
Fancy?
Yeah.
Fancy, yeah. I asked the same question down in Mississippi, and a girl said, slutty? And I said, no, you're thinking about skanky, but thanks for playing. Okay, so swanky. I've been telling that story for years and it never gets old for me. Swanky. So you could do one of these really nice nightclubs. Now, here's the problem. You've only got one corner lot. You can either do the snow cone stand or a nightclub. Now, students are always like, well, wait a minute, couldn't you have a snow cone stand during the day and a nightclub at night, and you can do it all at the same place? And the answer is the liquor laws won't allow us to do that. So there you go. Okay, so the snow cone stand requires an initial investment of $100, and then it returns payments of $50 for 3 years. So let's go ahead and get our calculators out, and we're going to say CS, second rear work. And I'm going to start with 100, negative, enter, arrow down. What's my C01 for the snow cone stand? 50. Enter, arrow down. What's F01? 3. Enter. Now, I want to compute the IRR. So I hit IRR. What button do I have to hit next? Compute. 23.375%. By the way, does that look familiar? Yeah, that's exactly the same number we got for the last one, even though we had a different set of numbers. And the answer to why that is has to do with the relative size of the cash flows. The first cash flow is twice as big as the remaining cash flows, the remaining 3 cash flows. And whenever you have that situation, the IRR is always going to be 23.375%. So I could have minus 2 million, plus a million, plus a million, plus a million. The return I guarantee would be 23.375. So the relative size doesn't matter. Now, while we have the calculator, or while we have this stuff in our calculator, let's go ahead and figure out the NPV. And I haven't told you this yet, but snow cone stands and nightclubs are identically risky. 10% required return. And so we're going to hit NPV. I'm going to put in 10 for my required return, enter, arrow down, and compute. 24.34. I want you to go ahead and write that down. 24.34. Now we've got an IRR of 23.375. That's greater than our required return of 10%. What is the rule? Do we accept or reject the project? Accept. We have an NPV that's greater than 0. Do we accept or reject the project? Accept. So far by itself, this project looks good. Now, let's go over, and by the way, I hope you wrote those numbers down, right? The IRR was 23.375, and the NPV is 24.34. Now let's go over here and look at the nightclub. The initial investment, 1,000, negative, enter, arrow down, C01, how much? 450, enter, arrow down. What for F01? 3, enter. Now I'm going to hit IRR and I'm going to hit compute. And we are getting 16.65%. 16.65%. Now I want you to remember back to what the IRR was for the first project. 23.375. What would you rather have? 23.375% or 16.65%? Yeah, 23.375. And so if you're purely using IRR to make your decision here, then you would choose project A. Let's see what happens when we do the NPV. 10, enter, arrow down, compute. I'm getting an NPV of $119.08. $119.08. How does that compare to the NPV for project A? It's bigger. What's the goal of financial management? Maximize shareholder wealth. If I'm following the goal of financial management and these are mutually exclusive projects, what should I do? Accept project B because it does more to increase shareholder wealth. Now, if they were independent projects, what would I do? Yeah, accept them both. They're both lovely projects. It's just a shame we can't do them both. Okay, now, how in the world can you get a greater NPV when you've got a lower IRR? And the answer is the magnitude of the investment. What's giving us problem here is scale. Yes, we can make 23.375%, but only on an investment of 100. I would rather invest 1,000 and get 16.65% because that's going to give me the greater NPV. So you remember when I told you that all that mattered was the relative size of the cash flows for IRR? That's what's causing the problem here because it's not taking into account the scale of the investment, and so that's why it can lead to bad decisions. Questions? Okay. Now here's another problem. Sometimes we have what are called unconventional or non-conventional cash flows. Let's start with talking about what conventional cash flows look like. In conventional cash flows, you have your investments up front. Now it doesn't all have to be at time 0. It could be at time 0, 1, 2, and 3 if you're building a factory. And those cash flows will all be negative. And then it will switch to being positive and the money comes in. So a conventional set of cash flows only has one sign change. A conventional set of cash flows only has one sign change. But in an unconventional set of cash flows, we will have more than one sign change. So how might we end up with this this weird set of two sign changes? And the answer a lot has to do with what happens at the end of a project. So in the United States, the way that we mine coal is that we knock the top of the mountain off, we scoop the coal out, and so when we knock the top of the mountain off, that's a big investment. And then as we're scooping the coal out, hopefully that's positive cash flows. But then at the very end, the government makes us do something very strange. Any guesses as to what the government makes us do?
Pay taxes.
Okay, so we're paying taxes all the way along, right?
You have to like backfill it or get rid of it.
Yeah, you got to rebuild the mountain. So you got this huge negative cash flow. By the way, when you knock the top of the mountain off, gravity helps you, right? Because that crap runs down the side of the hill. What happens when you have to put the stuff back?
It's harder.
Yeah, now gravity's fighting against you, right? So it actually costs more to rebuild the mountain than it did to push the top of it off. But we end up with this set of cash flows. We got a negative cash flow up front, we've got the positives while the coal's coming out, and then we have the negative at the end when we rebuild the mountain. Another example, the gas station. When you build a gas station, by the way, where is the gasoline stored at the gas station? In tanks underground. I worked with this girl in Mississippi, or in Louisiana. God bless her, she was so dumb. She said, how do they know where to put the gas stations? And we're like, huh? Like, after all, we work for an oil company, right? I said, how do you know where to put the, I said, what do you mean? She says, well, how do they know where the gasoline is in the ground? I said, oh, no, the gasoline's in tanks. She's like, oh. Okay, so the gasoline's in tanks. So you go in there, you bury the tanks, and you build a God bless her. You build a gas station on top of it, and then you're selling gasoline and beer, cigarettes, lottery tickets for many, many years with positive cash flows. And then at the end, do you know what the government forces you to do?
Dig them up.
Yeah, you got to dig up those gas tanks. Why?
Because they could potentially leak into the ground.
Yeah, they could have leaked. And then so you dig the tanks up, and then you scoop out the soil from around them, and you test it. And if there's no hydrocarbons in it, then you're good to go. If there are hydrocarbons, you have to keep digging until you get to a place where there are not hydrocarbons left, and you send that dirt off to somewhere, probably Kansas, to be burnt. Not much exciting going on there. And then you come back and you fill the hole. And so you end up with this exact same sort of unconventional set of cash flows. Negative up front, positive through the years of operation, and negative on the back side. Now let's see what that does, though, to our IRR. And by the way, don't get messed up, because this time we've got the cash flows horizontally. Usually we've got them vertically. Don't let that freak you out. So let's get our calculators out here and say CF second. Clear work. CF0 is minus 100. I'm going to enter, arrow down. What is C01? 230. Enter, arrow down. F01 is 1. What is C02? Yeah, negative 132. So 132 plus minus, enter. Now I can hit IRR and compute it. And it's telling me 10%. It's telling me 10%. Now, let's check and make sure that that's correct. We'll go to NPV, we'll put in 10, we'll hit enter, and we'll arrow down, and we will compute. And sure enough, we've got an NPV of 0. Is 10% an IRR for this project? By the definition, yes, it is. But I'm going to show you something freaky here. What if I put in 20? Enter, arrow down, compute. Negative 5 times 10 to the negative 13th. Now remember earlier I took 10 steps and then said the number. Well, this time it'll be 12 steps and then the number. And so that's like way less than 1 cent. Can we agree that this thing has another IRR? So now we've got multiple IRRs. And in fact, you're going to have as many IRRs as you have sign changes. You can have as many IRRs as you have sign changes. And so you've got to be really careful, because in these sorts of situations, IRR can lead us to a bad decision. So here's the situation. Oh, by the way, now you say, wait a minute, will our calculator tell us that other IRR? Well, if I hit IRR and compute, if there's another IRR, logically, I think if I hit down arrow, I should be able to see it. Or up arrow, I should be able to see it there. But the calculator is lazy. The calculator only gives us the first IRR. And it won't tell us that there are multiple IRRs. So you have to be able to spot these before you even step foot in them to know how this is going to turn out. Now this thing here is what we call an NPV profile. And that horizontal axis is the discount rate. And that blue line shows us the NPV of the project. Below the axis, it's negative. Above the axis, it's positive. So if my discount rate is 8%, my NPV is going to be negative. Now, we've got an IRR here that says we should accept this thing. If the IRR is greater than the discount rate, we should accept it. And so our IRR is 10% and our discount rate is 8%. IRR rule says to accept it, but what does NPV say? Reject it. Okay, well now let's go further up. Between 10 and 20, the NPV of this project is positive. Should we accept or reject? We should accept by NPV, but take a look at this. What if I told you that the discount rate was 12%? If you're comparing your IRR of 10% versus a discount rate of 12%, what would you do, accept or reject? So the IRR is 10% and the discount rate is 12%. We would reject it, right? And so they lead to exactly the opposite conclusion of what they should. So you've got to be very careful. Always look at your series of cash flows. If you have more than one sign change, do not use IRR. Let me say that one more time. Always look at your cash flows. If you have more than one sign change, do not use IRR. You say, well, what should I use? What did we use to disprove this? Right up here. What's the other thing? NPV. NPV works every time, assuming that you've given decent information. Any questions? So, why do people still use an IRR? Well, it's because it sums up a project in a single number that people have a feel for. By the way, this is a great exam question. It sums up the project in a single number that a lot of people have a feel for. By the way, do you think finance people end up being CEOs very often? No. Who's more likely to become a CEO? Oh, so yes, actually that is true. But who else? Marketing people. Oh my goodness, why? First of all, I'll give you a good reason. And well, actually they're all good reasons. The first one is that marketing people, they're the ones that are supposed to have their eyes on the horizon to know what's coming next, and they're the ones that are supposed to have the vision of where the company needs to go next. It kind of makes sense. Secondly, marketing people tend to like other people, right? As a finance person, I will be lucky to remember your name 12 seconds after I've met you, right? I guess I just don't care. But these marketing people, often you'll run into them. It was so weird. I ran into the first CEO I ever ran into. I was interviewing for a job, and he met me and he learned my name, and I saw him 2 years later, and I'm still just a peon, and he remembered my name. I'm like, there's no way in hell I could ever be a CEO because I couldn't remember his name, right? Okay, so. Marketing people. Do you think marketing people will remember? By the way, who are my marketing people here? Oh yeah, okay. Well, let's pick on Mr. Warren. Mr. Warren, do you think 5 years from now you're going to remember anything about NPV? Probably, because I picked on him today. That's why he'll remember it. I have a confession here. She says no.
She says no.
Oh, okay. Now, and that's fine. So here's the deal, finance people. When you're trying to convince the CEO about a project, if you don't have any of this other weird stuff going on and the IRR is greater than the discount rate, then the way you sell this project is you say, well, this has an IRR of 21%. Now, why does that mean anything to the CEO? First of all, they know that their average return on their retirement is 12%. They know that their mortgage is 7%. They have a feeling for these percentages, and so they know 21 is pretty big. Now, on the other hand, you've got to be careful. What if the IRR is 21%, but the required return is 25%? Do not tell the CEO the IRR, because they'll make the wrong decision. And you try to tell them about destroying shareholder wealth, and then their eyes glaze over and you're just done, right? So don't do that unless the NPV is also positive. Now, here's another good reason. If the IRR is high enough, you might not even need to find that appropriate discount rate, which we know was difficult from Chapter 12. So the IRR replacing the company truck is 45%. Do I really need to know whether the appropriate discount rate is 7% or 11%? Heck, it could be all the way up to 44%, and it would still be a good decision. Does that make sense? Okay. Now we're moving on to our final measurement here, the profitability index. And the profitability index is nearly as wordy as average accounting return. It's the present value of cash flow subsequent to initial investment divided by the initial investment. What does subsequent to mean? After. Yeah, so it's the payments that we're getting after the initial investment divided by that initial investment. By the way, initial investment here is always positive. Initial investment here is always positive. Initial investment here is always positive. Okay, now, if you think back to Chapter 4, we said that the NPV was the present value of cash flow subsequent to initial investment minus the initial investment. So I can do some algebraic rearranging and then figure out that initial investment plus NPV is exactly the same as the present value of the cash flow subsequent to initial investment. So now we're getting this thing more simplified. And if I distribute that initial investment on the bottom, I end up with initial investment over initial investment plus NPV over initial investment. What is initial investment over initial investment? 1. And so we end up with 1 plus NPV divided by initial investment. And so we can actually come up with a rule for PI by applying the rule for NPV. What's the rule for NPV? Accept all projects with NPV, greater than 0, right? And so if I stick any positive NPV into this formula, I'm going to wind up with a PI greater than 1. If I put NPV 0 in here, PI is equal to 1. So any NPV that's positive is going to give us a PI greater than 1. So we accept all projects with PI greater than 1. Okay, so what do we need for PI? Well, we need the initial investment amount, we need future cash flows and their timing, and we need discount rate appropriate to the risk of the future cash flows. Looks kind of familiar. In fact, we have to have NPV to calculate this thing, so we knew we needed those ingredients. So, does PI account for the time value of money? Yeah, it's got NPV in it. Does it account for the riskiness of the cash flows? Yeah, it's got NPV in it. Does it provide information regarding the wealth created by the project? Yes and no. It gives us, and if it's greater than 1, we know we're creating wealth. If it's less than 1, we know we're destroying wealth. But do we know how much? No. So just like IRR, it's going to be a 2.5-star measure. It's going to be a 2.5-star measure. So when is PI really useful? And it's during periods of capital rationing. Rationing is when you don't have enough of something to go around. My mom was born before World War II started, and they had rationing for butter, they had rationing for gasoline, for tires, everything. Why were they rationing those things? Because they didn't have enough for everybody to have all that they could afford to buy, right? So they had to ration these things. And it's the same thing with capital. If I don't have enough capital to fund all of my positive NPV projects, then I have to ration that capital out. So what do? Well, we calculate the PI for each of the projects, and we sort those PIs in descending order. What does descending mean? Yeah, from highest down to lowest, right? And then we start accepting projects until we run out of money. We start accepting projects until we run out of money. And so doing so gives us the biggest bang for the buck in this capital rationing situation. So we'll write a quick and dirty example up here. So I've got projects, and I've got the profitability index, and the initial investment. A, B, C, D. I have $100 million to invest. I've got a profitability index here of 3.25, 3.10, 1.92, and 1.75. And my initial investment for these projects, let's talk about what they would be. So this one's going to be $50 million. This one's going to be $20 million. This one's going to be $40 million. And this one is going to be $30 million. Should I take on project A? Two reasons. Yes, two reasons. Number one, the PI is greater than 1. And number two, we have $100 million. How much does this cost? $50 million. Now, after I make that $50 million investment, how much money do I have left? 50. The next one has a PI greater than 1 and an initial investment less than the amount of money we have left. Should we make the investment or not? Absolutely. So how much money are we down to now? 30 million. The next one has a PI of 1.92. Is that good? Yeah. Do we make the investment? Why not? Yeah, we don't have enough money. This thing requires $40 million and we only have 30, right? And so we jump down to the next one and it's got a PI greater than 1. And lo and behold, we have exactly the right amount of money here, so we jump into it. So that's how you would use the PI in the real world. Now, what kinds of organizations are likely to be facing capital rationing? Number one, startup firms. When you are starting up a firm and you've got this great idea, you've probably got several great ideas, and you've got lots of places you could invest money, the people that you go to for the money will probably say, whoa, whoa, easy there. We're not going to give you $100 million up front. We'll start you off with $10 million. Well, what should you do? Well, let's figure out where our best bang for our buck is. And that's what we're going to do here, is we're going to rank our projects in descending order of PI. The other place that we see this, and in fact I had a student in class tell me about this. He was a civil engineer, and he had been working at an engineering firm that was interacting with FEMA. What does FEMA stand for? Federal Emergency Management, either agency or administration, I forget. They're the people that show up after hurricanes and they bring in shelter and ice and stuff like that, food, and they'll show up after tornadoes. And you'd say, well, wait a minute, how could, what does this have to do with engineering? Can you prevent a hurricane? No. Can you prevent a tornado? No. Can you prevent a flood? Short of building a dam, can you prevent a flood? No. But can you prevent damage from floods? The answer is yes. What they do is they go in and they buy up properties that are in flood zones and tear them down. Now let's walk through this. Why in the world is the government interested in doing this? And the answer is because our government is so dumb. If you choose to build your house next to the river and you get washed out, now of course I'm oversimplifying this, but our government says, oh, you poor baby, You've lost your house. Here's some more money. And what does Ha then do? Where does she like to live? Down by the river. Where does she already own the property? Down by the river. So what does she do? She rebuilds. And what happens 3 years from now?
It gets washed away.
It gets washed away again. And I'm like, oh, you poor baby. Here's some more money, right? Do you see how this is? Yeah, so basically, we're not producing positive cash flows down the road. We are avoiding negative cash flows down the road. So this is the way it works instead. She gets washed out, and I say, okay, we're going to buy you out. You can go somewhere else. We're going to buy you out. And then, why do you think we have to actually tear down her house? What happens if you leave a structure vacant and standing? Say again?
The debris washes away everywhere.
Okay, so the debris washes away as a public safety concern?
Someone's gonna go squat in it.
Oh yeah, someone's gonna go squat in it, and they're gonna cook meth, they're gonna shoot heroin, lonely teenagers looking for love. I mean, there's all sorts of people who go to abandoned buildings. So for public safety, we've got to push that thing away. And then what do? We turn it into a nature area or a public recreation area, right? Where people can go hang out, barbecue, whatever it is that people do. Okay. Now, how does this work at FEMA? Every year, the government sets aside so much money and says, if you've got projects, let us know. And the last thing that they ask you to do on that form is to figure out the PI, put it in the upper right-hand corner of the application, and then they all go off to Washington, D.C., where I assume some intern sits there and by hand sorts them from the top PI down to the bottom PI. And they go through and they do this process that we do until they run out of money. And then they send letters to all the losers and say, try again next year, we might have more money, who knows, right? But these other people get their projects funded. Now, how does the engineering firm make money off of this? Well, they get a fee for finding the project and managing the project for tearing it down. And the one that this guy got torn down was a restaurant down in Ozark, and it was called like the Little River Inn or something like that. You could tell exactly where it was located, down by the river, right? Okay. So that's how this gets used by FEMA. It does have a problem though. It can lead to bad decisions for mutually exclusive projects. Go ahead and write the NPVs in for these. I believe the first one was 24.34 and the other one was 119.08. And so we can figure out the PI for both of these. The PI for the first one is 24.34. Divide by 100 gives us 0.2434 plus 1. So the PI would be 1.2434. The PI for the second one would be 119 divided by 1,000, which is 0.119 plus 1 gives us 1.119. And so that would be the PI for the second one. If I were purely using PI to decide which project to do, which one would I choose? Yeah, I would choose A. And it would be wrong because we have the same problem here that we have with IRR. And that is that PI does not take the scale of the project into account. If I just look at the number of PI, I cannot tell whether I'm able to invest 100 for that PI or if I'm able to invest 1,000 or 1,000,000. I can't tell. So for the same reason, PI gives you bad decisions for mutually exclusive projects. However, it does not have the same problem for multiple IRRs. Because after all, remember, NPV always gives us the right answer in those situations, even though IRR does not. So what happens in the real world? So some finance professors went out and they talked to the top financial thinker at firms large and small and said, tell us, how often do you use these things? 4 being always and 0 being never. And our top 2 winners at both large firms and small firms are IRR and NPV. And that makes perfect sense because once you've done, when we do an example here in class, I'll show you, once we have the NPV analysis set up, it's that easy to get IRR. So you always want to do both. Now notice that IRR and NPV happen more often at large firms than at small firms. And there's a couple of reasons for this. Do you think perhaps large firms have larger projects? Yeah, and we said that sometimes for small projects, things like payback might be better. And so that's one of the reasons that we see large firms having more of this. Another one is this. When you are just starting out and you're hiring your first financial thinker, do you hire an accountant or a finance person? Yeah, you hire an accountant because you don't want to go to jail, right? You want to get your taxes right so you don't go to jail. So your first financial thinker you hire is an accountant. And so if you're a small firm and you still have an accountant as your top financial thinker, maybe these finance measures aren't as important. Okay, now we go down and we see that payback method is less popular at large firms than at small firms. And for the same reasons we just discussed. Large firms are likely to have larger projects, so that means small firms have smaller projects. Also, smaller firms less likely to have a sophisticated financial thinker involved with figuring these things out. Discounted payback, dog with fleas, and I'm pleased to see it doesn't score any better than this. And you'll notice that accounting rate of return is even less popular, and it still gets used more at small firms than at large firms because most likely the financial thinker at the firm is an accountant versus a finance person. And then finally, profitability index. You'll see it's the least popular up here. And you guys say, well, wait a minute, maybe that's because profitability index sucks. And the answer is no. These are all American companies that have been surveyed. The United States has very well-developed capital markets. If you've got a good idea, it's almost certain that you'll be able to find someone to fund it. And so there's not very much capital rationing. There's not very much capital scarcity. And so this is not very popular. Now, I was giving this statement one night, and I did not mention that these are American firms, and I had a young lady sitting on the front row from Vietnam. And she said, no. I said, what do you mean no? She said, it's very hard to get capital. I said, are we talking about in Vietnam? And she said, yes. A couple of differences. Number one, Vietnam does not have well-developed capital markets. They've got some, but not well-developed. Number two, when you go to the bank in Vietnam, who owns the bank?
The government.
The government. And so when you go, and here you are, you're a private company, and you walk in at the same time as one of the government-owned companies, and you both ask for a $100 million loan, and they've only got $100 million to loan out. Who do they give the money to? The government. First of all, they're on your team, right? Secondly, will I ever get blamed for loaning money to a government firm? No. Thirdly, what's my expectation if that company defaults? What do I expect? I expect the government to bail them out. And we're seeing that going on in China right now. And finally, the government basically ran out of money to bail out these government firms, and things are going terribly sideways. Are there any questions? Next time, Chapter 8. I will see you then.